What would you say was the hardest part to develop in LittleBigPlanet?
Well, that's a very good question. I think I'm just deciding what story to tell here.
Right.
I don't think there was any particularly standout. I think finishing it was hard. I think just shipping it, growing a company, doing all of that on a new platform, blah, 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 all of that was hard. So LittleBigPlanet in general was a very rewarding but also extremely difficult period of, I don't remember, but one thing, so basically, one thing that was tricky was that PlayStation Network was new, PlayStation 3 was new, LittleBigPlanet was new, company was new, the idea of user-only content was pretty new, certainly in the game, so on and so forth. So everything was new. So basically, if you can imagine, it's like fog of war. It's like you're constantly surrounded by fog of war, and every aspect of LittleBigPlanet, we didn't really know what was lying just in front of us, and we just like blindly and bravely and stupidly sometimes just like plowed forwards. And one of the ones that was most tricky was that when you had a disagreement, and it's not that the other person was in bad faith or that they were wrong. It's just that you're both in the fog of war and you have a disagreement. And you're like, where do you go? And at the time, and I've shared this with like developer friends, but I think it's long enough ago that it no longer relates at all to anything to do with what goes on. So it's old enough history that I can recount the story. It's to do with servers. And so basically we were an unknown studio to Sony, like we experienced people, but we had never shipped a game. And they had an online technology group that had created, and they were, by the way, the OTGs I know were amazing through the years of, I have to give them a shout out. They basically maintained the LittleBigPlanet servers all the way through 1, 2, 3 and beyond. They're an amazing group, and they did a lot of selfless work, like maintaining this thing. But at the earliest version of OTG, they hadn't shipped a lot of games either online, and the best game they'd shipped, I believe, was MLB, Major League Baseball, had an online server. And so they said to us, we would like you to use the code of MLB online, whatever it was called at the time, as the starting point for LittleBigPlanet servers. And I was like, okay, fine, can I have the code? And it's like, no, the code is too complicated for you to compile. So we will hold on to the code in the servers, and we will hold on to the database, and you will just get an API that you can call from the PlayStation to do whatever you need to do. And it's like, well, LittleBigPlanet's not really very much like a Major League Baseball game. So how's that going to work? And they're like, well, you'll just have to figure it out. And we won't change any of the databases, and we won't change any of the tables. So we had to basically bend LittleBigPlanet 1 to fit into pretending essentially to be MLB. I can't remember the exact details beyond the fact that it was insane. Like this didn't last, but at the starting point in the fog of war, they were like, oh, online's hard. You're a new developer. You're not going there. You can use what we already have that we know works. And I just knew it was a disaster waiting to happen. And now Naughty Dog is going to enter the story, into the chat. Again, I hope this is long enough ago that it doesn't matter. So I was getting more and more frustrated with Sony, and at the time I was naive and I didn't understand their motivations, and I was like, this is never going to work, and the game's going to fall over on day one because it just doesn't match. And at the time there was this new thing called Amazon Web Services, or AWS, which at the time was brand new. Like literally I think they had only S3 and EC2. So if anyone knows about that, there was 2 services on AWS. I think there's probably like 400 now. AWS was this shiny new thing. And I went to E3 and I met up with my friend Christoph, who at the time was the co-president of Naughty Dog. And I was like, have you heard about this AWS thing? And he was working on Uncharted 1 at the time, I think. And I was like, have you heard of, maybe it was Uncharted 2, but I think it was Uncharted 1. And I was like, have you heard about AWS? It's amazing. You can just like, with a credit card, you can sign up and get a server, and then you can like run some stuff on it. And then there's this thing called S3 and you can put files in it. And I remember just saying I was very excited about it, and so I told him about this. And then I went back to London, and Sony won the argument. They were basically like, no, you're going to have to ship with MLB. So I started work on the LittleBigPlanet servers AWS edition secretly, skunkworks. And I made them so that we had the MLB servers, and then we had, which were run by Sony, and then we had the AWS ones. that were completely skunkworks. And but I knew that when we shipped on day one, it would be the official legit servers. At which point Uncharted shipped before us. And Christoph rang me up and went, "Hey, thanks for the AWS tip. What did you do for AWS in the end? How did you solve this problem?" I was like, "Oh, I didn't do it. We're going with the Sony solution." And he said, "Oh, well, I did it. And our game, uses AWS." And so I think they ended up taking the crown as the first PlayStation game that ran on AWS. So that was actually very crucial to the end of the story. So now we come to the final chapter of the story. The LittleBigPlanet 1 came out, and I don't remember the exact timing, but within a day or two, the MLB servers were overloaded. And it wasn't their fault, it's just that LittleBigPlanet and MLB are very different. And so the car crash that I saw coming happened, and they were trying to fix it. And so I said, "Well, just so you know, guys, I've actually got the skunkworks server that I wrote, and it's running on AWS, but I know that you don't officially support AWS, but I've heard that Naughty Dog are running a game in production on AWS. So maybe I can take some of their learnings and you can bless it, and we can switch the LittleBigPlanet servers over from the MLB ones to the AWS ones." And thanks to Naughty Dog blazing the trail, because the servers were crashing, they switched it over to AWS, and that began a long story called AlexDB, and the poor old OTG in Sony had to end up maintaining AlexDB for many years, which I think is probably going to cause a shiver down their spines. But so I apologize for that. But it was a necessary evil, and it got LittleBigPlanet to run through 1 and 2, and I think even 3. But yeah, so that was there you go. That's the story I've not shared in that much detail before, but it was to summarize, LittleBigPlanet was hard because everything was new, and it was like fog of war, and everyone was doing their best to make the best decision they could, and every now and then we'd end up colliding with pits of lava or each other, and as we stumbled around. That was one of the examples that made it hard. But shipping a client update, I touched on earlier, like we were making decisions about developer assets versus user-generated content assets. And basically you had to patch LittleBigPlanet every time you wanted to release new DLC. So because it was developer content, because there was only a path for new developer content, including DLC, could only go through the patching system. So basically what would happen is you would patch LittleBigPlanet with the new DLC, or bug fixes and mitigations for problems. And I'll get to that, and that's why this is relevant. And again, this is ancient history, and this is like LittleBigPlanet 1 era. So it may have changed, I may be wrong with all of those caveats. At the time of LittleBigPlanet 1, we had to patch the game to do any kind of change, whether it was a bug fix or new DLC. And then the actual DLC itself was just unlocking something on the store. Basically, when the day it released, you'd say, right, okay, this content is allowed to be used now, because we know that we've pushed out the patch. The problem is that patching, and I actually admire PlayStation for this, the QA process and the patching process is very full on. Like, so PlayStation has a big, long QA process, and you have to get in line behind all of the games that come out on PlayStation, not just first party. And there's lots of money involved in localization and testing. Basically, releasing a patch is not a small thing. It involves hundreds of people around the world, lots of money being spent. It's a big deal. And so that decision we made, that every single asset is a developer asset, meant that LittleBigPlanet had to be patched every time we did a new costume, every time we did a tiny, tiny thing. And it just got more and more and more costly in terms of like how long it took to put out a small patch. So for example, I'm sure that the heart glitch problems that will be running on the PlayStation 3 inside the PISH VM could have been mitigated. But by the time those things were happening, I imagine that the people who knew the code, like me, had long gone, right? They weren't around to fix the code. And worse, the appetite to send out a really expensive patch costing a lot of money was probably less and less and less over time. So which I'm saying is like, fixing these things was technically possible, but in practice, in reality, there maybe wasn't the manpower or the money available or the time available to actually fix it. And that's the thing that's very sad. And if I had my time again, I would, if the fog of war lifted and I could see everything with the benefit of hindsight, you might build a system where it was either easier to hand over to the community, and I know you've been trailering and hinting at the fact that you've done incredible decompilation and reverse engineering, archiving, and I know that there's various efforts, and I wish in hindsight that we'd made those efforts easier. But the culture, certainly within PlayStation, was that it was very much a walled garden, and that like the idea that you would build for the future, for a community future, for for an open source, even where the servers might be open source, that was not even like back in 15 years ago. Within PlayStation, within the bubble of PlayStation, that was like an alien concept. I think these days it's probably very, very different. But so if I had my hindsight 2020, but I don't think I would have won that battle if I'd tried. Like if I tried 15 years ago and said, hey, we should make the servers in such a way that anyone can run them, I just would have been shut down. There's no way that would have I would have won that battle. But I wish I'd tried harder, but that's what it is.